Extract 1. Questions 1 to 12. You hear a primary care doctor talking to a patient called Hayley Dove. For questions 1 to 12, complete the notes with a word or short phrase that you hear. You now have 30 seconds to look at the notes.
So, Mrs. Dove, I have your notes here, but it would be good to hear things from your perspective. How all this started, what treatments you've had, anything you think I should be aware of.
Well, where to begin? I should explain that I'd been suffering with endometriosis for quite a long time, ever since my son was born, actually, and he's at university now. So I was used to a certain level of discomfort, feeling bloated a lot of the time, getting the occasional bouts of nausea and feeling quite a bit of fatigue.
Right.
Anyway, after a while, I also started to get pain in my lower back, and that gradually got worse and worse. I was working as a preschool teacher in those days and had a young family of my own. It was a tough time. In the end, I had to give up my job. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I was eventually diagnosed with cervical cancer.
Oh.
I was fairly lucky, I guess. It hadn't advanced too much, and I was advised to have a hysterectomy. Although I was out of action for a while, it all went relatively smoothly, and of course it also sorted out my other problems. So for a while I was relatively well. My kids were at school by this time, so I was able to start my own business, working online as a recruitment consultant. I'd put both illnesses behind me, and I was feeling very positive.
But then you started to develop other symptoms.
That's right. Those feelings of fatigue started coming back. I'd find I was exhausted after a full day of online meetings. If I did have to go anywhere and do anything, like attend the occasional conference, especially if it involved driving any distance, that would just wipe me out. So something obviously wasn't right. Anyway, I went to see the doctor, and he said that it sounded like I might have iron deficiency anemia, and he did some blood tests. But when the results came back, I was really surprised to find I actually had iron overload, and the next step was to test for hemochromatosis, and of course that came back positive. And the first thing the doctor asked was whether anyone else in the family had ever had it, because it can be genetic. Anyway, I didn't know for sure because I was adopted as a baby, and I'd only just recently traced my birth mother and started to get to know her. Anyway, she was able to confirm that some cousins, whom I'd never met, had indeed got the same thing.
I see. So, have you been having treatment?
Yes, I was told that the only option was venesection. That came as a bit of a shock, and I had it every week initially. Then once a month, and I've been going every 3 months for some years now. I mean, it's fine. It hurt a bit at first, but I'm left with quite a bit of scarring on the arm where the needle goes in. But it's something I can live with. For the last few years, I've been back to my usual energetic self.
So, what brings you here today?
Well, I've started to develop some other problems, and I'd just like to have them checked out. I mean, I'm not getting any younger, so these could be completely unconnected with the blood problem. Anyway, the first thing is that I've started to get a bit of stiffness in my joints. It's particularly noticeable in my fingers, but I think it's there in my knees too. Then I also seem to be getting more thirsty than usual, and it doesn't seem to be related to how much I drink. And the other thing is that I get a bit short of breath sometimes, even when I haven't been doing anything particularly strenuous. Just walking the dog or washing the car, and it suddenly comes on. And none of these things is a big deal, but I've just noticed the change.
Sure. I'll ask you a bit more about those symptoms in a moment, but what I'd like to do first is have a listen to your chest.
You hear a physiotherapist talking to a patient called Marvin Chainey. For questions 13 to 24, complete the notes with a word or short phrase that you hear. You now have 30 seconds to look at the notes.
So, Marvin, I understand you've been referred to me because you are experiencing some symptoms of long COVID, and your doctor suggested that some physiotherapy could help.
That's right.
I've got your notes here, but as we haven't met before, could you just run through for me how all this started, any treatment you've had, and anything else you feel I should be aware of?
Yeah, sure. It all started when I caught COVID-19. I mean, I hadn't been vaccinated, so maybe it was worse than it might have been, but who knows. Anyway, I had it pretty bad, but not bad enough to go to the hospital. I had the usual flu-like symptoms that turned into a dry cough. It completely wiped me out. I never felt so sick in my whole life, but I got over it, and in time, the symptoms pretty much disappeared. I was coughing for about a month, but otherwise, I thought I'd beaten it.
I see. So when did the long COVID symptoms start?
I'd say like 6 weeks afterwards. The cough had gone, but I still wasn't feeling 100%.
Right.
Looking back, the whole experience had kind of sapped my energy. I didn't feel like going to the gym like I used to do before because I was getting out of breath just doing ordinary things like carrying groceries. Then other stuff started happening. I wasn't sleeping properly, so I was tired pretty much the whole time. Like, I'd wake up with a headache, and it would go on all day, just get worse and worse, and that's when the other symptoms would kick in.
Okay.
Like, my brain would go kind of fuzzy, so I couldn't focus on anything properly, and I'd start to get this thing where I couldn't remember stuff. Like, words would be on the tip of my tongue, but just wouldn't come out. I mean, that was weird. Anyway, at first, I didn't make the connection with COVID. I assumed something else was going on. And when I started to get palpitations and chest pains, I went to see the doctor because I thought it must be a problem with my heart.
Yes, of course. So, did you get a diagnosis and treatment then?
Well, I had all kinds of tests, including an ECG, and they put me on a heart monitor for 5 days. And that's when they said it was arrhythmia, and they put me on beta blockers. And I did start to feel better, like almost immediately. And they also said that my vitamin D levels were low and that I should take supplements for that. And that helped too.
Okay.
And they said this was all down to long COVID, apparently. And I'm still getting some strange symptoms despite the medications. And that's why I've come to see you.
Okay. Tell me about those and how I might be able to help you.
Well, basically, if I overdo things, like if I try to do too much or if I get anxious, then I start getting the symptoms again. Mostly fatigue, but also a certain amount of joint pain, often in my hips, but it can also affect my ankles, even my feet sometimes.
Right.
It's like a dull ache, and it seems to be related to the fatigue. I also get a certain amount of numbness in my fingers, which is a bit worrying. I mean, I still do quite a bit of exercise, but I mostly do gentle stuff. Like, I've always done yoga, but I've also recently started doing Tai Chi, and that seems right for me. I would like to start going to the gym again, though I'm aware that I shouldn't do anything too strenuous. So I was hoping to get some guidance on strength building exercises. I mean, should I be using things like resistance bands or even trying light weights? It would be really good to do things like that, but I feel I need to do it under someone's guidance at the moment.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you for all that background, Marvin. That's really given me a good idea of what we need to do. I'd like to start by